This series is based on a true story. The events take place in a small German town, Ottern. Pediatrician Dr. Liesen, examining another young patient, Franziska, concluded that inappropriate actions had taken place. Hearing the doctor's verdict, his assistant Jenny looked at the patient with sympathy. Soon the news of what had happened to Franziska spread throughout Ottern. In Berlin, waking up with a terrible hangover, criminal defense lawyer Richard Schlesinger received a call that immediately snapped him to attention. He needed to get to the courthouse immediately. Richard lives alone, smokes a lot and drinks. His home is a typical bachelor's den. Before leaving, he glanced briefly at a photograph of his late wife. It was already late at night, but Richard was on the list of lawyers who could be called at night. This was surprising to the judge, given that Richard was the best in his field, not some inexperienced graduate. Without giving a direct answer, Richard impatiently asked the judge to explain the case. The judge briefly stated that it was the usual scenario. One spouse decided to get rid of the other for insurance money. The accused was named Sabine Kramer, and Richard, as her lawyer, was allowed to speak with her. He was taken to the holding cell where she was being held. Sabine insisted that she had not harmed her husband. Richard explained that this did not matter. If she could not refute the accusation before the judge, she would remain in custody until trial. Richard strongly advised his client not to speak to the police without his approval. Any careless word could be used against her. Sabine continued to insist on her innocence, knowing that most likely everyone in her position said the same thing. The judge presented the charges to Sabine, pointing out the evidence against her. Shortly before his death, Sabine's husband had taken out a large life insurance policy. Sabine had no alibi, but she did have a gun inherited from her father, and a motive. The judge denied bail, arguing that the accused had relatives abroad, her mother lived in America, and her daughter in Italy. This could tempt her to flee. Richard intended to file a motion to change the preventive measure. After that, Sabine Kramer was taken away. The judge allowed himself a personal remark to Richard, whom he had known for 25 years, saying that he looked terrible and should quit drinking and get more fresh air. But Richard already knew that. Right now he was living on autopilot. At the door of his apartment, Richard saw a familiar face, Azra, who mentioned the Chinese and their rules. Suddenly the woman started beating the lawyer, reminding him that the Chinese always asked for proof. Afterward, she took a picture of injured Richard. When he regained consciousness on his couch, Azra was sitting nearby. Richard owed money to the Chinese, and if he did not repay the debt soon, Azra would be forced to use more severe measures next time. She would rather not have to do that, as she had nothing personal against Richard. He had only a week to come up with the money. Before leaving, Azra advised the lawyer to stop drinking. Everyone seemed to be telling him that today. To get the money, Richard decided to pawn his expensive watch. It was enough to cover the debt. The man Richard owed looked at his bruised face and noted that Azra knew her job. Incidentally, Richard had once been Azra's lawyer and had secured her acquittal. When the Chinese needed someone to collect a debt, they always sent Azra. She had never failed. To feel less lonely, Richard decided to buy a goldfish. At home, after placing his new pet in an aquarium, Richard poured all his alcohol down the sink and started cleaning. Then he began studying the case materials. Was Sabine guilty? During their meeting, Sabine pointed out his bruises. He dismissed it as nothing serious and suggested they get to work. Some time ago, her husband had made a bad investment in stocks, gone bankrupt, and was unable to continue paying the loan for his jewelry store. Sabine did not deny that she had often argued with her husband over financial problems. She had no idea who might have wanted to harm him. Richard pointed out that the shot had been fired from behind. Someone had crept up on the victim. Sabine had nothing to say, she only stated that she had loved her husband. Richard countered that love did not exclude criminal intent driven by greed. Either way, the defendant's husband was dead, and the court would still find someone guilty. Richard went to the library but couldn't find what he was looking for. Perhaps Sabine really was guilty, although she did not seem like the kind of person capable of such a thing. At home, Richard continued meticulously studying the case files, hoping to find at least some clue on which he could build a defense strategy. However, he once again concluded that Sabine was guilty. Realizing that he had no chance of winning this case, Richard was about to turn to the Chinese again, but Azra stopped him, suggesting they have lunch together and talk. They went to one of the best restaurants in the city. Although all the tables were occupied, all the city's businessmen feared Azra, so the restaurant owner personally offered to serve their table. Azra directly asked Richard what he wanted from the Chinese. He had been the best lawyer in Berlin until the scandalous case in which the man Richard had defended in court was acquitted and then got drunk that very night, taking his daughter's life. Richard was indeed the best in his field, but the truth was that not everyone who seemed innocent actually was. Azra only hinted that Richard had chosen the wrong side. He did not understand what she meant. Now Richard was trying to figure out who Sabine really was, a ruthless criminal or an innocent victim? What was hiding behind her harmless appearance? It was already the 5th court session, and Richard Schlesinger had not said a word or made a single statement. Sometimes he even dozed off. The court had finished reviewing all the evidence except for the key one, so Herbert Petters, a firearms expert from the Forensic Institute, was called to testify. Herr Petters confirmed that the bullet found at the crime scene had been fired from the defendant's gun. For the first time during the entire trial, Richard decided to speak, presenting the court with irrefutable evidence that the bullet's trajectory did not match the expert's conclusion. If the bullet had been fired from that particular gun, the casing would have fallen to the right, not the left. Herr Petters was forced to confirm the lawyer's correctness. Richard then reached a logical conclusion. The defendant's husband had fired the shot himself. He had simply held the gun incorrectly, with the grip facing upward, which caused the casing to be ejected to the left, misleading the investigation. The motive was also clear. The man staged the crime so that his wife would receive money from the insurance company. Thus Sabine was acquitted, which became a real sensation in the press. Richard's name appeared in newspaper headlines again. Meeting with Azra, Richard asked her how she had known about the wrong side. Azra responded with a counter-question. Why in his opinion were there no fingerprints of Herr Kramer on the gun and no traces of gunpowder on his hand? Now any additional details were impossible to uncover because the body had been cremated. Azra said nothing more. In exchange for her assistance, she only wanted a favor from Richard. It was about a certain client who was willing to pay any price to make a particular person agree to reveal the truth. The problem was that this person was currently in prison and would not speak until he was released. This was connected to a high-profile case in which 25 people had been arrested for crimes against children. The one who had been arrested yesterday was the 26th, and he was the one who was supposed to talk. Azra wanted Richard to secure an acquittal for that man. Before Richard could respond, he suddenly felt unwell. Social worker Ina Reut worked with children in difficult life situations. She met with young prosecutor Cordelis to hand him a flash drive containing her interviews with various children. They believed that together they could bring the case to court. However, Cordelis still had some doubts. Richard was hospitalized due to a stroke, but Azra believed there was no reason for him to stay here for long, as work awaited him. But the consequences turned out to be much more serious than expected. Richard's brain no longer perceived the left side of space. He shaved only the right side of his face, ate only from the right side of his plate and skipped words while reading. This condition was not treated with pills but required therapy, which could take anywhere from several weeks to several months. Azra couldn't wait that long, so she told Richard that they were leaving right now. Prosecutor Cordelis had been involved in the trial in which 25, or rather now 26 people had been arrested. This case had caused a significant public outcry, and Cordelis had gained popularity on social media. Ina Reut, an employee of the Child Protection Society, played a crucial role in this. The first arrests had taken place 11 months ago. Richard and Azra went to Audern. Richard shared that he did not like beautiful cities because they usually hid ugly truths. Azra still has matters to attend to here, so Richard checks into the hotel for now. When the receptionist heard Azra's name, she immediately began treating Richard as an honored guest. At the hotel restaurant, Richard was met by colleagues, other lawyers. Most of them were convinced that this case was a losing battle from the start since many children had given testimonies. It was unlikely that anyone would believe all of them could have lied. On the other hand, all 26 defendants denied their guilt. It all started when a woman accused her ex-husband of unacceptable actions toward their daughter during a custody trial. There was no objective evidence apart from the children's testimonies. Therefore, there was a high probability that the judge would rely on public opinion since society already considered those people guilty. Understanding that he should start by interviewing his client, Richard went to the prison to meet Ernesto Perez, a former bar owner. The defendant immediately demanded to see his lawyer's ID because Richard's appearance left him doubtful. Richard presented his lawyer's ID, explaining that he had been hired by Azra. But Ernesto had never heard that name before. However, since he didn't have a lawyer anyway, he agreed to let Richard defend him in court. As he signed all the necessary documents, Ernesto begged Richard to help him. Later, Richard met with Judge Landsberg. He was introduced to Cordelis, who would be leading the prosecution. Richard immediately expressed his concerns about the fact that Cordelis, in an interview with journalists, had publicly declared Ernesto guilty before the trial had even taken place. Richard considered this unprofessional. The presiding judge agreed with the defense attorney, as did the judge, stating that the court was not interested in public opinion and even less in what was written on social media. The judge also announced that the court might find the children's testimonies insufficient, and therefore the panel required more objective evidence. There were 16 alleged victims. Cordelis was outraged that the judge was willing to question the testimonies of potential victims, arguing that there was no one else to protect them. The judge patiently reminded the prosecutor that they could not ignore the fundamental rules of criminal proceedings, even if the nature of the case provoked strong emotions. Thanking everyone for taking the time, the judge asked Cordelis to stay behind, telling him that if the prosecution's case fell apart, it would be the biggest judicial scandal in the country. However, despite his young age and lack of experience, he was confident in his victory. Azra enjoyed working with Richard. Unlike most men, he didn't flirt with her and treated everyone equally. Richard replied that he was not a judge to decide what was right or wrong. After a preliminary review of all the case materials, Richard concluded that proving Ernesto's innocence would be very difficult. In addition to the children's testimonies, there was also an expert report stating that acts of an unacceptable nature had taken place. This was bad news for Azra. They decided to find someone in this city who was involved in organizing such vile activities or at least knew something about it. Azra had already identified the owner of the local brothel and intended to pay him a visit. Naturally, Richard went with her. However, things were not that simple. The bouncers refused to let them into the establishment. Instructing Richard to stay in the car, Azra took gloves and plastic wrap from the trunk, covering the driver's seat so as not to stain it with blood later. Advising Richard to stay put, Azra returned to the bouncers with a hammer in hand and taught them a lesson. Watching this from the car, Richard couldn't help but feel admiration. Acting like a true professional, Azra first got rid of all traces of her work. Patiently waiting in the car, Richard couldn't take his eyes off her. All of this was happening in the woods. Azra always kept a spare set of clothes in the trunk for such occasions. She had to make sure not to leave any traces. Under the cover of night, they stopped on a bridge and Azra threw the hammer, the instrument of crime, into the river. Azra, by the way, had already dealt with the brothel owner as well. It turned out that he had nothing to do with Ernesto Perez's case or the other 25 people. Meanwhile, a prison guard during a routine inspection discovered something unexpected in cell 36. A 76-year-old woman, Helga Gsling, who was in custody, had harmed herself, leaving a farewell note stating that she couldn't take it anymore. Soon Richard learned about it from a newspaper article. Helga Gsling was the mother of one of his colleagues' clients and had been held in pretrial detention for 9 months for aiding and abetting. On Twitter, users left comments under the news, claiming that the old woman couldn't bear the weight of her guilt and that this could be considered an indirect confession. This was clearly not in Richard's favor, unlike for Cordelis, who actively used social media to his advantage. Azra, looking understandably grim, gave Richard a ride. He mentioned that it was humiliating for him to constantly step out of such an expensive car. Richard intended to speak with Commissioner Laubach, who, as it turned out, was not leading the investigation into Ernesto Perez's case. In fact, it was Prosecutor Cordelis. The investigation had been ongoing for quite some time, yet Richard was the first lawyer to have entered the commissioner's office during all that time. The only pieces of evidence seized from the suspects were laptops and phones, but none of the devices contained any materials that could indicate their owner's involvement. Moreover, there were numerous inconsistencies in the case that the investigation had simply overlooked. Commissioner Laubach believed that Prosecutor Cordelis was merely seeking fame. The entire prosecution's case was based on the testimony of children provided by social worker Ina Reut. But if they had falsely accused Ernesto and another 25 people, what exactly could be her motive? Without delay, Richard met with Ina Reut, who was clearly reluctant to speak with him, but he didn't give her a chance to refuse. Ina Reut stated that all lawyers were accomplices to crimes because they defended the deeds of criminals. Richard calmly countered her words, explaining that he was not defending crimes but people who could not be considered guilty until the court declared them so. That was how justice was born. They argued at length about morality and law, but Ina Reut did not change her mind, believing that children never lied and that the law should always be on their side. Realizing that he could not convince her, Richard concluded that something had happened to Ina in the past, and now she was taking revenge on everyone. But this was no game. Real people would be put on trial. Later, Richard told Azra about his conversation with the commissioner, from whom he had received some materials that had not been included in the case but were shocking. Richard showed Azra recordings of Ina Reut's interviews with the children. Ina Reut asked questions in a way that led the children to certain answers, promising them ice cream and other treats in return. This made Azra recall a distant memory, when she first looked at a hammer and thought about harming someone. Now Azra was about to meet Jenny, a pediatric assistant. Richard urged Azra to be polite and not to use her usual methods of obtaining information. Richard spent the rest of the day carefully reviewing the case materials once again. Suddenly the lights went out in his hotel room, and he called in a technician, who quickly fixed the problem. However, now the bulb emitted a cold light instead of a warm one, which was unusual for Richard and distracted him from his work. But when he switched the light, it sparked an interesting idea. How he could refute the testimony of the potential victims who claimed that a camera lens had been suspended from the ceiling in the room where all those terrible things had allegedly happened. Richard had been working on this case for 8 months now, and there were only 10 days left until the trial. He had prepared well, knowing that the children's testimonies were full of inconsistencies and contradictions. However, in any case, the expert psychologist's opinion carried decisive weight. In Richard's view, the expert had been negligent in their duties, as it was obvious that Ina Royd had provoked the children into lying. The key issue was that the judge would most likely rely on the expert's opinion, so Richard suggested bringing in a new, independent expert. Seeing a photo of Richard's late wife, Ezra commented that she had been beautiful and that he was not to blame for her death. But Richard did not want to talk about it. Right now they needed to focus on the case. Ezra hinted that the old expert might not show up in court. Catching her train of thought, Richard told her not to even consider it. They could not simply eliminate witnesses. Richard understood that Ezra's mysterious client had a strong reason for wanting Ernesto to be freed. But Ezra did not reveal that reason. When she asked him why he wanted the fish, Richard replied, "To change my life." Ezra had something else for Richard besides his fee, a car, a gift from the client. It was in fact Richard's old car, the one he had been forced to sell 4 years ago. Ezra said she would never have chosen such a vehicle herself. Before Richard left, Ezra advised him to pull himself together. After all, it had been 5 years since his wife's passing. Richard clearly did not appreciate Ezra prying into his personal life. Driving his old Mercedes, Richard felt a wave of nostalgia. The past continued to haunt him. The trial would soon begin, and Richard and Ezra would be waiting for it in Auburn. Meanwhile, social media was overwhelmingly against the accused, with most people believing they did not even deserve to be called human, and that their lawyer was no better. That night, Richard woke up to the sound of a drunken mob vandalizing Ezra's brand new, expensive sports car. Richard knew that retribution would not be long in coming. And indeed, despite his attempts to dissuade her, Ezra was determined to track down the vandals and get even. A police officer arrived to question potential witnesses. Richard, with hidden mockery, explained that there were 4 hooligans, all of average height, dressed in black and without any distinguishing features. Richard flatly refused to go to the police station, even though the officer, displeased with the witnesses' tone, tried to insist. The first hearing took place. The prosecutor filed a motion for the court to reject the defense's request for a second expert examination. During the break, a journalist approached Richard to ask a few questions about his defense strategy in what seemed to be a hopeless case. Out of nowhere, Richard began telling the journalist about an old court case that had also caused a public outcry. It was believed that a woman had been secretly poisoning her husband's tea with rat poison for a long time until his life was cut short. Although the woman insisted on her own innocence, the police did not believe her because traces of thallium, the rat poison, were found all over the house. It was assumed that the woman had disposed of the body in the river to prevent an autopsy from revealing traces of thallium. In the end, the woman was found guilty and sentenced to life in a psychiatric hospital, until several years later, during a scorching summer, the remaining body parts were discovered. Among other things, it turned out that traces of thallium were present in every home because it was a common element in fireplace soot. Thus the woman was acquitted when the case was reopened, and her husband's death was ruled an accident. In other words, the high concentration of thallium in her home was an expert's miscalculation. So truth is not always determined by the majority. This is how Richard intends to defend Ernesto. Of course, Ezra had already found those who had smashed her car and made them regret it. The same fate awaited anyone who dared to accuse her or Richard of defending monsters. Richard and Ezra got into her new car. That same day, Richard asked the local monastery for a room because he was uncomfortable in the hotel. Pastor Kepler was more than willing to accommodate his request and led him to the scriptorium, which provided ideal conditions for working with papers, something Richard needed, given the large number of case materials that were not in digital format. When the pastor asked if Ernesto was guilty, Richard preferred not to answer. He had long since stopped believing in God, yet despite everything, he still believed in humanity. Journalists flooded the courtroom. Ernesto tried to shield his face from the camera lenses. The judge firmly asked all journalists to leave, announcing the start of the hearing. The first witness to be called was Dr. Liesson, the pediatrician. While Cordelis watched smugly, trying to interject with objections from time to time, Richard questioned the witness in a way that led him to admit he was colorblind. This meant that the doctor could not clearly recognize redness on the skin of the potential victims. Richard also asked Dr. Liesson, who had graduated from university over 30 years ago, when he had last attended a professional development course. Liesson replied that he was a practicing physician and had no time for that. Richard further proved that many of the signs Dr. Liesson had considered evidence of abuse were, in fact, physiological features. The doctor had no choice but to admit that his assessment might not be absolute. Cordelis was clearly displeased with how things had turned out. Barely maintaining his composure, Dr. Liesson also admitted that a swab taken from the potential victim had not been examined but had been discarded. A murmur of outrage swept through the courtroom. Did this mean that the only physical evidence determining the fate of 26 people had been thrown away? The doctor could not explain how this had happened. Another question troubling Richard was why Dr. Liesson had referred his patients not to social services but to a private organization, to Ina Reut. With the court's permission, Richard played one of the case's video recordings, in which Dr. Liesson pressured a young patient into allowing an examination. The boy was adamantly against it, but the doctor insisted, using less than gentle wording. For some reason the patient's refusal to be examined led the doctor to conclude that inappropriate actions had taken place. Outraged exclamations echoed through the courtroom. Everything pointed to the fact that the doctor had never had any real evidence of abuse. He had drawn his conclusions based solely on his own assumptions and had contacted Ina Reut. Since the prosecutor had no questions for the witness, the judge announced a 1-hour recess. Even the lawyer's strong arguments did not change public opinion. Some were even outraged that the lawyer had ridiculed the doctor in court. But Richard had his own idea of justice. The next witness was Commissioner Laubach, who stated that nothing suspicious had been found in the laptops and phones of the suspects. Richard also confidently countered the prosecution's arguments regarding the ceiling-mounted video camera. Nervously, Cordelis interjected, pointing out to the court that one of the potential victims had described a bar located near the football field. Ernesto's Tavern fit that description. The commissioner noted that there were 17 other establishments in the area that also matched that description. She also admitted that the investigative authorities had shown extreme incompetence in this case. Cordelis's main argument was that all the children spoke of a painted koala, which could not be seen from the road, only from the entrance to the tavern's basement. Commissioner Laubach was determined to get to the truth to correct the investigation's mistakes. Her son, a rookie police officer, was helping her with this. Laubach began studying all similar cases from the archives. There was a lot of work ahead. It was Ina Reut's turn to testify. While questioning her, Richard was able to reveal that from the balcony of her house, where she had recorded interviews with all 16 children, Ernesto's Tavern was visible from the back, including the image of the koala. Ina Reut began voicing her indignation, arguing that the children were incapable of making something like this up. But her arguments did not hold up under scrutiny. Richard publicly declared that Cordelis and Ina Reut were the true culprits because this was a crime against all those who truly needed help. It was an unforgivable mistake by representatives of justice, blinded by their own ambitions. This speech, delivered in the presence of the press, had such a strong effect that silence fell over the courtroom. Regaining composure, the judge announced that the court would begin reviewing the legality of the detention of all 26 defendants, but this did not yet mean that the verdict would be acquittal. The inconsistencies in the testimonies of the potential victims were not direct evidence of their falsehood. That evening, Azra invited Richard, who was busy working, to sit in her latest car and drove him out of the city, where a stunning view opened up. It was the perfect moment to ask Richard whether he truly believed all those people were innocent. Richard reminded her that he was a lawyer, not a judge. He was simply doing his job. Azra knew that. She never told anyone what she had experienced many years ago. Richard understood that even the fact that most objective evidence had been disproven might not be enough for an acquittal. They needed something more. That night, Richard received a message from an unknown sender and asked Azra to find out who it was, though he already had a hunch. Azra needed an hour to do so. Ernesto was nervous, awaiting the verdict. The outcome would determine whether he would spend the rest of his life in prison or in freedom. For all participants in this trial, the night was sleepless. Despite the late hour, Richard went to the monastery, where many things reminded him of the court. These analogies helped him focus. The pastor was interested in the trial, and Richard did not mind his presence. Conversations with the pastor led Richard to some interesting thoughts. Realizing that some pages of the report were missing, Richard immediately called Commissioner Laubach. When the 17th day of Ernesto Perez's trial began, Richard demanded that the court session be interrupted for 4 hours to file an urgent motion regarding the court's bias. The judge declared a recess. Once all outsiders had left the courtroom, Richard asked the judge to remove Cordelis from the trial, pointing out that the second interrogation of Francisca, one of the alleged victims, had disappeared from the case files. And there was a reason for this disappearance: that second interrogation would have put an end to the entire trial. Cordelis had to admit that he had deliberately removed the second interrogation from the case files, justifying it by claiming that Commissioner Laubach had conducted the questioning improperly. Of course, such actions were unacceptable, but the prosecutor was not removed from the case, only the testimonies of his experts were deemed invalid. Thus Richard and Azra achieved what they wanted: a new expert. Deep down, Richard understood that Cordelis had not acted out of malice. In Azra's world, people pay for their mistakes with their lives. Richard told her that her world was doomed. Soon the trial resumed. The new expert, Professor Brandenburg, evaluated the testimonies of all the children, concluding that they were unreliable because Ina Royd had likely instilled in her wards what she wanted to hear, making them believe in the truth of those events. Moreover, the children's statements had changed over time. Richard promised Ernesto that everything would be fine. There was very little time left before the verdict. Today Richard was planning to check out of the hotel where he had spent the most perplexing months of his life. After asking the press to leave the courtroom, the panel of judges announced the verdict: Ernesto was found not guilty. What people on social media thought about it no longer mattered. The courthouse was surrounded by the press. Richard gave a brief comment, meeting the gaze of the smiling pastor. Cordelis sat alone in the empty courtroom. Richard sat down next to him, saying that everyone makes mistakes and that experience comes with time. Cordelis truly regretted what had happened because as a result of his actions, all 16 children had been sent to an orphanage, and it was there that most crimes against its wards occurred, something the director of that very orphanage had confessed to this morning. There was video evidence. Not much time had passed when Richard's goldfish died, but he wasn't particularly upset. He informed Azra that the orphanage director had been sentenced to 6 years in prison. Azra thanked Richard for his work, saying that the anonymous client was pleased with him. At that moment Richard received a call from Commissioner Laubach, who informed him that his client was dead. She also asked Richard if he knew Azra. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel not to miss more exciting new products. Also, the authors will be pleased if you leave your opinion in the comments.